Hello and welcome back. Today I want to discuss what I consider to be one of the most widely misunderstood phrases in the Book of Mormon. We find this phrase in Alma 41:10, where Alma is speaking to his son Corianton. The phrase is, "Wickedness never was happiness." We'll be discussing what it says and maybe just as importantly what it doesn't say. At first glance it appears that Alma is saying that if you're wicked, you'll never be happy. And some people take it a step further and conclude that if wickedness never was happiness, then righteousness never was sadness, and therefore if you're sad or depressed, it must be because of something that you did. And the concept that if things aren't going your way, you're probably guilty of something is nothing new. We find it in the Bible in John 9:2, where Jesus' disciples asked him, "Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" By the way, if you're looking for a hat tip to the pre-existence, that verse is a good one. And maybe it's just me, but as I've gotten older, I've found that my happiness depends a lot more on the decisions of my loved ones than decisions that I make myself. When my kids or loved ones make good decisions, I'm happy. When they make bad ones, I'm sad. When Jesus wept, it wasn't because he had been sinful. And I can simultaneously be happy about one loved one and sad about another one. And we're supposed to mourn with those that mourn, which means that being righteous will include being sad. So what is that verse talking about? What does wickedness never was happiness mean? A lot of the confusion has to do with the word happiness. Nowadays, the word happy refers to an emotional state. But is that what the Book of Mormon prophets meant? Were they saying that your feelings would depend on your righteousness? Before we answer that, let's look at one more verse. In Mormon 9:14, while summarizing the plan of salvation, Moroni said the following, "And then cometh the judgment of the Holy One upon them. And then cometh the time that he that is filthy shall be filthy still, and he that is righteous shall be righteous still. He that is happy shall be happy still, and he that is unhappy shall be unhappy still." Without context, that verse, especially the second half of the verse, might seem unfair, confusing, or maybe even scary. If you're happy, you'll be happy still. If you're unhappy, you'll be unhappy still. So if someone is chemically depressed in this life, is that a promise that that will continue? Or, to use an extreme example from the other direction, if a drug dealer dies while on a fun family vacation in the tropics, does this verse promise him more of the same in the hereafter? Unfortunately, the definition of happiness has changed in the nearly 200 years since the Book of Mormon was translated. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines happiness as enjoying well-being and contentment. It's a word that describes a mental or emotional state, and by this modern definition, our drug dealer luxuriating on the beach with his family is happy. But what did it mean in 1827? So happy comes to us from the Old Norse word hap, which is best translated as luck or chance. It's the root word of mishap or happenstance and other words related to luck. When Robin Hood hit a gold coin with an arrow at 50 paces, some of his men called it a happy shot and said that he needed to do it again. When Shakespeare's Henry V was rousing his men for battle against the French, he described the envy that future generations would feel that they were not among the, quote, happy few, or lucky few, privileged to fight in the Battle of Agincourt. And it's not just English either. Feliz in Spanish comes from the Latin word felix, which means luck. And if you've read the Harry Potter series, the good luck potion is named Felix Felicis. And if we look up the etymology of happy, we read this. From Greek to Irish, a great majority of the European words for happy at first meant lucky. An exception is Welsh, where the word first meant wise. The changing definition of happiness also has political significance. When Thomas Jefferson listed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as God-given rights in the Declaration of Independence, what did he mean? He borrowed the phrase from John Locke, except Locke listed our fundamental rights as life, liberty, and property. Ben Franklin reportedly encouraged Jefferson to use happiness instead of property because it was more encompassing. But in that light, the Declaration of Independence is not asserting our right to feel good as much as our right to seek our fortune. In 2010, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy talked about that. He said, "The framers used spacious phrases, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness. Happiness to us today has a hedonistic component." By the way, hedonistic means self-indulgent or pleasure-seeking. Continuing with the quote, "By going back to the Greek origins of the word, happiness means self-respect, dignity, and worth from making civic contributions." Aristotle, an ancient Greek whose writing Jefferson would have studied, distinguished between 4 different types of happiness: sensual gratification, ego gratification, satisfaction with doing good to others and improving the world, and what might be translated as divine fulfillment. So, the right to pursue happiness may have originally meant that you had the right to make meaningful contributions to the world, rather than meaning that you had a God-given right to try to feel good. That's the hedonistic component that Justice Kennedy was talking about. And the way it's used in the scriptures, prosperity might be a better synonym for happiness. In Alma 50, 19 through 23, Mormon links happiness to prosperity. He summarizes God's promises to his people that inasmuch as they shall keep my commandments, they shall prosper in the land. And he uses the Nephites under Captain Moroni's leadership as an example of this. He says from verse 23 in that same section that there never was a happier time among the people of Nephi since the days of Nephi than in the days of Moroni. The Greek definition of happiness that referred to your behavior and contributions rather than to your feelings or chemical state is also consistent with its usage in the Book of Mormon. In Alma 41:11, 2 verses after telling his son that wickedness never was happiness, Alma presents happiness as being aligned with God's nature. He says, "And now, my son, all men that are in a state of nature, or I would say in a carnal state, are in the gall of bitterness and in the bonds of iniquity. They are without God in the world, and they have gone contrary to the nature of God. Therefore they are in a state contrary to the nature of happiness." Listen to what he's saying. Contrary to the nature of God equals contrary to the nature of happiness, which seems to be saying that being happy means being aligned with God's nature. Used in that context, the phrase wickedness never was happiness is saying that wickedness never was God's nature. So recapping a bit, the reason that the phrase wickedness never was happiness causes confusion is because the definition of happiness has changed since the 1820s when the Book of Mormon was translated. In the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, happiness referred to a holistic state of human flourishing or prospering. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, psychology emerged as a field, and by the middle of the 1900s, happiness was primarily understood as a psychological state, and economic well-being fell into a totally different category. But knowing that happiness originally included both temporal and spiritual well-being helps make more sense of Mosiah 2:41, which says, "And moreover, I would desire that you should consider on the blessed and happy state of those that keep the commandments of God. For behold, they are blessed in all things, both temporal and spiritual. And if they hold out faithful to the end, they are received into heaven, that thereby they may dwell with God in a state of never-ending happiness. Oh, remember that these things are true, for the Lord God hath spoken it." So when God promises never-ending happiness, we're going back to where we started, when he promises that he that is happy shall be happy still, or when he says that wickedness never was happiness, he's not talking about our feelings and emotions. He's not saying that we'll never be sad. In Moses 7:28 and 29, Enoch asks God, "How is it that thou canst weep?" The shortest verse in the King James Bible is John 11:35. Jesus wept. Can one simultaneously be happy and sad? Our modern version of the word happy says no. But can someone who is flourishing and prospering also experience all of the emotions and feel all of the feels? That seems more realistic. Let me give you one more thing to think about. As we've discussed, a state of happiness means a state of prosperity or a state of flourishing. But in 2 Nephi 2:11, Lehi lists happiness and misery as opposites. if you're paying attention, at the beginning of that same verse, he says that holiness and misery are opposites. So in that verse, happy and holy are basically synonymous. So the phrase, wickedness never was happiness, is not talking about how you're going to feel again. It appears to be saying that wickedness never was holiness, or that wickedness and prosperity are in opposite directions. Was any of that news to you, or do I have it wrong? Do you have any thoughts on what we've talked about? Let me know in the comments, and we will see you next time.